What is the biggest mistake you've made in a job interview? Story 1. Did not prepare for the what are 3 things you can improve on skill-wise question. Job was to work disabled kids. I said I could improve my patience, not my timeliness, not my communication, not my team-building skills. Patience. Stupid, LOL. Story 2. Interviewed at a bank. Was going perfectly despite how nervous I was, and I was probably in with a great chance. Then, as a final question, the panel asked me, "Why should we hire you?" And I word vomit replied, "Because I probably won't steal your money." I was not hired. Story 3. Attending in the first place. At the end of an IMO, productive 2-hour interview, the most arrogant of the 3 interviewers revealed that the job they were offering was actually for a position 2 levels down from the one for which I had applied, at a little over half the salary. I simply gathered my resumes, literally yanking one out of the hand of one interviewer, put them in my portfolio, and walked out. Story 4. I once interviewed to sell an allergy medication, pharma. It was a launch of a twice-daily rival to getting allergy shots, which are monthly. Interview was going well, and I get asked, "Do you have any questions for us?" See, I do homework, and when this comes up, I ask real questions as I don't want to get stuck working somewhere I don't like. So, Product X is a twice-daily product, costs the patient more than shots, nets the doctor less money per visit, and has about the same efficacy. What is your current strategy or vision in successfully getting this into the market and well adopted? Needless to say, the director did not like my question and just said, "Well, that's where you'd come into play." I wasn't offered the job. It's okay, because after that answer, I didn't want it anyway. Story 5. It was at a popular craft store. They asked what crafts I like to do, and I have 0 craft talent. I lied and said I liked making jewelry because I did so in school once. They hired me, and whenever a customer had a jewelry question, they always asked me. I eventually learned the ropes, though. Story 6. Not exactly a mistake, but I went to the counter of the store and asked if they were hiring. They said they were and gave me an on-the-spot interview right there in the middle of the store with my mom standing right with me. I was 16 and she had given me a ride to the store. My mom proceeded to answer every question for me and kept talking me up. I ended up getting the job and worked there for over 2 years, so thanks, Mom, LOL. Story 7. My interview was at 6 in the evening. The interview was at a coffee shop right across from the business. The owners were going to close up for the day, then meet me at the coffee shop for the interview. I got there early, but since I didn't want to loiter, I bought a coffee so I could sit at a table to wait for them. They eventually showed up, maybe 15 minutes late. I never noticed until that day, but I'm pretty sensitive to caffeine, so by the time they showed up, I was a little too high energy. I was rambling a lot more than I needed to. In the moment, I thought I was doing well, but it wasn't until afterward that I realized I probably should have ordered a tea or something. I didn't get the job. Story 8. My first job interview was a bullshit group interview, and they were asking a bunch of questions related to pop culture and movies I hadn't seen because, at the time, I lived a fairly sheltered life. They then asked what our favorite animal was, and I knew I had to say something to stand out from everyone else. So when it came to me, I just blurted out flamingo, since I thought that would be a unique animal that no one would think of, but didn't think far enough ahead to actually justify why it was my favorite animal, and so completely blanked on the follow-up question. Pretty sure I came across as a raving lunatic. Story 9. I was dead asleep when a hospital supervisor called me for a transport position. Being half asleep, I answered like it was a driver position in the middle of the interview. He stops me mid-interview like, "You know this is an internal position, right? You move patients in-house." I apologize and mentioned I work 3rd shift and just got to sleep and asked him if we could redo the interview. He laughed and said he had time. I was hired a week later, and he picked at me, jokingly, for a couple months about it. Story 10. Interviewer. What's your biggest weakness? Me, Mr. Funny Man. Bullets. Panel of interviewers give me concerned looks and stare in silence for a good 10 seconds. I got the job, been here for 13 years, but man, that was brutal. They said that they didn't get the joke at first and assumed I misheard the question and were giving me time to re-answer. After I left the interview, they were going over everything and then realized that I meant being shot is my weakness, and they all laughed. Story 11. Not asking them, from my POV, the questions they asked me. Example. Them. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Me. What opportunities for advancement, training, growth, and pay increases are offered to new hires in their first 5 years? I do typically ask how the position became vacant, It's usually telling when your interviewer badmouths previous employees. If they don't say something avoiding and vague or tell you someone had a baby or some other reason for leaving and goes right into how bad the last person was, run, don't walk the hell out of there. Story 12. I asked if I should negotiate my salary. To the guy interviewing me, I said what I was thinking out loud. His expression still burns in my brain to this day. But I got the job. Impressed the heck out of him and myself, honestly, and really enjoyed it. Had to leave sadly to help raise my grandkids after 6 months. They tried to keep me, offered more money, even a contract position working from home, way before COVID. But I had to give all of my attention to my grandkids. But yeah, that moment still embarrasses me to this day. Story 13. I landed an interview with Moog Inc. I sailed through the questions about my past work experience, how I deal with problems, etc. Then the interviewers asked me what I knew about the company. I said, "Oh, I know about Moog synthesizers. Moog Inc. has nothing to do with Moog music synthesizers. They make precision controls for things like planes and rockets." In my own defense, this happened in 1980, before everybody had personal computers, so researching a company was a little more difficult than it is now and would have involved a trip to the library. But still, I should have done my homework about the company, and I didn't. Anyway, things turned out okay. I didn't get the job, of course, but the interviewers were very nice. The company flew me out for the day, treated me to lunch, and gave me money for my expenses. I ended up with more money than I started with, and I learned a valuable lesson. Story 14. Not walking out the second I realized they pulled a bait and switch. We were more than halfway through the interview before the listing says X, but we're looking for Y. I sucked it up out of desperation. I should have taken literally any temp job until I was back on my feet, or got temp to hire. But desperation and logic often do not go hand in hand. I found out later 2 others backed out. Then they tried to force me to do unethical, likely illegal things. I did walk. I was in a worse place after that. Listen to your gut and know your worth, y'all. Story 15. I know this wasn't the question, but I'm gonna share a non-mistake. Something surprising I did right. The interviews were held at a cafe. The people interviewing me offered to buy me a coffee and I accepted. I was later told that's the main reason they hired me. Every other person had been too nervous to say yes. Because they were in the cafe all day, taking up one of their tables, they felt like they had to keep buying coffee. They'd already drank so much coffee they felt sick from it. They were so relieved and grateful that I took the cup of coffee because it meant they got to take a break from it. Story 16. First job out of high school, it was for an ER tech. Think nurse's aide, but in the ER position. The interview was a group interview between myself, HR, and the Director of Emergency Services. He introduced himself to me as Dr. Charles. Through the entire interview, I, without realizing it, kept calling him Dr. Sharts. Luckily, he had a good sense of humor, as did everyone else on the panel. I thought I majorly crashed and burnt, but the following week I got a call from HR to start onboarding for the ER tech position. I have to say I didn't expect things to go that way, but I'm glad they did. Story 17. When I was a teenager, I had a phone interview for a big box store. The man asked me something along the lines of, "How did you go above and beyond for a customer in your last position?" I was caught off guard, but I remembered there was an old blind lady that would come into the gas station I previously worked at with her service dog. So I told this man, I went above and beyond by walking a blind customer out to her car. The phone went dead silent. He wrapped it up quick and surprise, surprise, I didn't get the job. Story 18. I was interviewing for my first IT job. This was a massive deal for me. Higher pay in a field I love and get me out of the hellhole of destroying my body for a wage. This was also an internal job posting, so my time with the company was a plus. However, I had zero experience in IT, besides my general knowledge and self-taught experience. In this job, I work a shift rotation of nights and days, 12-hour shifts. The first day of nights is always the hardest because I just never get a good sleep, which is Monday night, so I get off 7 a.m. Tuesday morning. Well, Monday afternoon, I get a message asking what shift I'm working so they can interview me. I tell him, and he asked if I would like to come down first thing 7 a.m. Tuesday morning. I was so stoked, I immediately agreed without thinking about it. Cue first night. Barely make it through, riding on about 3 hours of sleep. Par for the course, but since I'm always moving, it's usually not too bad. Finish my shift and go to the interview ready to go. Then I sit down, in a nice, comfy office chair that reclines with ice-cold AC running and dimmed office lights. My brain liquefied and I became barely coherent. So, they come in to start the interview. The only 3 IT people in the plant. They were hiring 4 IT troubleshooters to have one on each shift. The manager, the hardware guy, and the network guy. I muddle through best I can until right in the middle of answering a question I completely forgot what I was saying or what the question even was. They just stood there staring at me like I was some sort of amorphous blob waiting for me to do something interesting. I just apologized, told them I was foggy from lack of sleep, and we moved on. I was certain I bombed the interview and didn't get the job. I dwelled on it for weeks as I had yet to hear anything back. Still got the job. I asked the guys later about it and they thought it was fucking hilarious. Story 19. Had an interview for a cabin maintenance position at one of the biggest cabin companies here in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. It was one of those stupid performance-style interviews where you work for a day's pay to see how well you perform. They do this because they have trouble keeping maintenance people. At the end of the day, they told me that I performed exceptionally, and they wanted me to start the next day. Okay, cool. They then proceeded to tell me that my first week would be an on-call week, which means I had to be up and ready to go at the drip of a hat up until 1 a.m. if there was a resident issue, and told me that I'd need a bulletproof vest for these night calls. I walked straight to HR, grabbed my check for that day, and noped right out of there. Story 20. I have a very narrow skill set that applies to hospital funding and social work. I've had job offers from all over the country and have a pretty solid reputation. So I interviewed with a company in the Nashville, Tennessee area. The first interview was with someone from HR who really seemed excited about my background. So they scheduled me to Zoom with someone in management. She's one of the rudest people I ever encountered. My resume was sent to her days before the interview. She picked everything I had ever done apart and insulted me on numerous occasions. She actually said, "You have never been with an employer at least 7 years. I'm sorry, but the type of work I do constantly changes with new laws and new facilities. I should have disconnected and literally told her to F herself. To this day, I feel like not putting her in her place was a mistake." Story 21. I got in a fistfight in a parking lot of a fast casual restaurant with my sister the night before. She was being the hugest bitch I can't even tell you, and chose to deal with the trauma by drinking an entire bottle of homemade wine in under 30 minutes, then going out to the bar with friends where I proceeded to sob inconsolably in the smoking area. It was at a big chain movie rental phone place. The interview was with a friend of mine who was assistant manager, and there was an ad on repeat for a horror movie blaring in the background. And I kept jumping at the slashing noises. I had to walk home 7 kilometers in 35-degree heat. I got the job. Story 22. Okay, so this is gonna sound crazy. I work in construction. There's a reason for that. Earlier in my life, about 11 years ago at age 25, I tried to break into the tech sector. Got an interview with a huge company. I couldn't believe I actually got the interview in the first place. The morning of the interview, my dad gives me some advice. So I get to the interview and it's going really well, about 3/4 of the way through the interview, during an awkward moment of silence. A lull, if you will. I locked eyes with the person interviewing me and let out a 7-second fart that had this perfect high pitch coming off the leather chair. It echoed in the room. I really thought she was going to burst out laughing and that I would establish dominance and get the job. Turns out she was higher up in the industry than I thought possible. I was essentially blacklisted and couldn't get another interview for anything substantial to save my life. 16 years later, I get by, but my fucking back hurts. A lot. Thanks, Pop. Worst part is, I had just gotten him a Hash One Dad coffee cup with Tiger Woods on the cup as well. BC, he has a huge boner for golf. After the interview, I was feeling he was more of a Hash 12 dad and would have modified the mug if I could. He still drinks his coffee out of it to this day. While I rub a wall or a piece of wood with paper with sand on it, paper with fucking sand on it. Story 23. I had interviews at McDonald's and Popeyes. Both places didn't even bother actually asking me questions to see what kind of employee I might be. They just immediately shoved onboarding papers into my hand and informed me when my first day was, both of them telling me it was specifically scheduled for the 1 day each week that I was entirely unavailable. The Popeyes manager made a habit of verbally abusing employees, including me, in front of the district manager. And when I quit after a few days, he refused to pay me for the work I did and instantly removed access to my pay stubs somehow. He'd also lied to me about my hourly rate in the interview. He told me I was starting at $14/HR, and when I logged into payroll during the brief window when I had access to it, I was only making $12/HR. The manager for the McDonald's was so wildly disorganized that she couldn't even keep track of who quit and who still worked there. I went in person to quit the job after my first shift, in favor of the Popeyes job, funny enough. And a few days later, she texted me asking why I hadn't been showing up for work and when I was coming back for training. I texted back reminding her that I had quit in person, and I forget what she responded with, but I remember it being very rude and huffy. I took these jobs because the job I was working at the time and ultimately ended up sticking with had severely cut my hours from nearly 30 a week to not even 10 a week, and both wanted to give me 30 a week at least. At the end of that summer, after I quit both the other jobs, they gave me more hours again, and I've since been upgraded to full-time with a consistent 35 hours a week. I was 20 years old at the time and had very little job experience, so I didn't really understand how interviews and jobs are actually supposed to work. Story 24, circa approximately 1999. It was during college when I was living at home about 40 miles outside of Boston. I was working during a co-op with about an hour commute if things went my way. Not in Boston. A friend of mine got a job inside Boston, right near Charles River, making 60% more than me per hour. I asked if they were hiring, and he said yes, getting me an interview. I told my boss at the time, and she said I should definitely go on the interview. It took me 2 hours to get there for the interview. I was displeased to say the least. It wasn't even peak traffic time, was something like for 1 p.m. Somehow, I was still early. They called me in to start the interview early. My phone rang. I put my finger up to the person interviewing me to wait a moment and answered. It was my father asking if I'd gotten there okay. I said yes, that I was in the interview already. He said I probably should get back to it then, and we hung up. The person interviewing me just sat there staring at me, surprised I'd answered my phone. Went back to my current job the next day, and my boss asked how it went. I told her it went great. She said to let her know if they offered it to me, and not to accept anything without talking to her again. About 2 weeks later, my boss's boss at the time called me into her office. She said she heard I was offered another job at 60% more. They decided to give me the same increased pay and retroactively pay me back to the first of the year. It was the start of February. I immediately accepted this. I ended up being really competent at that job considering I was an intern. Was told I was better than some of their seasoned devs as my code was nowhere near as buggy. Another week later, the company I had interviewed with called, asking why I hadn't called about the job and if I were still interested. I said no thanks. The commute was too much. I guess the mistake I see here is answering my phone. I don't think I would do that again as I value interview experience these days, even for jobs I have no intention of taking.